Crickets. So we always read this story on the first Sunday of Christmas, the Gospel of John. And each Gospel has its own narrative of Jesus' beginning. In Mark, Jesus starts as a young man, so it's the beginning of his mission. In Matthew and Luke, they go back a little bit and give us the narrative of Jesus' birth. And each of these is different from the other, and Luke is the more familiar one that we read on Christmas because it has the most, flair. Angels and shepherds and all that. But John goes even farther back, much, much farther back, and takes Jesus back to before time, before the creation of the universe. So if this was a contest of history, John would win, I think. And this is where the Gospel of John gets kind of a bad rap sometimes. I know every Bible study I go, if they're going to do John, people kind of groan. That one's so hard. It's so theological and wordy. Well, if you think about it, all the Gospels are theological. It's just that the other three make you work a little harder to figure it out. What are they really saying, right? And John, he kind of just puts it out there for you, even if it is a little wordy. So in this way, I think John is more understandable than the others. But many people complain that John puts Jesus on too high of a pedestal, that he emphasizes the divinity of Jesus over his humanity, and therefore Jesus becomes less relatable to us. I think that is a little unfair, and we'll keep on that theme as we go. But this story is John's birth narrative, believe it or not. The story of Jesus' birth in a manger that we're used to tends to focus on the humanity of Jesus, that Jesus was one of us, because he was one of us. And John seems to focus instead on the divinity of Jesus. And I say seems with a good reason. Because John exalts Jesus on one hand, explaining creation and how he existed before creation. But then on the other hand, he tells us about how the Word becomes flesh and dwelt among us and was rejected and died. In order for Jesus to serve as the conduit of God's grace and truth, he has to be God in the fullest sense, and in order for the Word to reach us, for us to hear it, Jesus had to be fully human as well, to share our lives and to suffer and die like we do. For as John writes, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. And this is the awe that I was talking about on Christmas Eve, if you were here for that. We talked about how God coming down to earth as a human being is a really big deal. And we seem to have lost that awe and wonder of that fact, God coming down to be human, amidst our sanitized, cute Christmas nativity story that we tell every year. John has to explain first how divine Jesus is, so that we can understand the magnitude of what is happening here. Jesus is God. God has intervened in the world before. John mentions Moses and the law, but God never actually manifested God's self into the world. So we need to understand that in order to properly be awestruck by the Christmas story. But once that awe washes off, what do, right? What is Christmas? You can buy all sorts of party hats and things that say, Happy Birthday, Jesus, which I kind of think is a little tacky, but that's another sermon. So it's Jesus' birthday. We celebrate Jesus' birthday. But as David Lowes explains, the Gospel of John is less interested in Jesus' birth and being ultimately more interested in our birth, our new birth as children of God. Because Christmas is the time that we celebrate our birth as children of God, the keeping of God's promises, and the beginning of the restoration of all creation. And that's pretty awesome, right? So what does this all mean now for us, thousands of years after these stories take place? Well, As we hear in John, God is timeless. So these stories aren't just static history in the past. They play out every day of our lives and every day that we claim our identity as God's children. John writes that Jesus gives us grace upon grace. God blesses us with salvation and gives us grace so that we can share it with others, not hoard it for ourselves. Because we have this grace and salvation, it doesn't give us permission to sit back and relax and wait around for Jesus to come back. It means that we are loved in spite of our flaws, and we have to also share that with everyone else in the world. Sometimes it's difficult to find grace these days, I find. And often in the lives of Christians as well, and in the church as well, we all get caught up in our day-to-day life and lose sight of the overarching mission of God. Thomas B. Slater writes, quote, "The Christian church must become more ethical and less theological," end quote. He continues to explain that often we Christians hold on to our doctrine or tradition so tightly that we tend to forget the ethics of Christ and the love of Christ, which is the whole purpose of our mission. He says, the church needs more Christians who are not aloof but loving, who care for others simply because they need help, Christians who seek to become a blessing for others instead of always looking for a blessing. So this is what Jesus' birth means in John. And this is John's Christmas story. It's a very unsentimental one. God, fully divine, comes to earth fully human and shows us how to be. To love, to bestow grace, and to change the world for the better. Christmas means love and joy, but it also means change. And upheaval, upending of power structures and all that, and living in awe of the power and love of God. Instead of focusing on the baby and the manger and the shepherds and the kings, John instead focuses on the actual incarnation. And instead of talking about the birth, John focuses on the difference that birth makes to us in life. Jesus is the Word that becomes flesh to be one of us so that we can be children of God. And that's what God calls us to be, God's children. People who deserve love and respect and will be used by God to care for the world and change it in dark times. And into the darkness of this world, God sent Jesus to bring grace and truth and be the light and the Word. So now, as followers of Christ, we must be the light and the Word in the world. That is Christmas. It's not a holiday or a festival. It witnesses to a reality that weaves throughout our whole lives. Wherever we go, whatever we do, we are the light and we are the Word. And sometimes we're the only light or word that someone will ever hear or see in their lives. It's a big responsibility. But Jesus never told us it would be easy. But that's the meaning of Christmas. And that's the meaning of being a child of God. We go into the world as light and as the Word, and we go together. We travel always together with each other, with Jesus on our side. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.